This is a story called Waltz of the Agonizing Ones by Scare in a Box from the creepypasta subreddit. The night was silent and calm at St. Juilliard's Hospital. The doctors were tranquil and content. The patients slept comfortably in their beds, and there had been no deaths today. All was good in the serene building. Amidst the tranquil setting, Tanya lied awake on a bunk bed in the residence corner, thinking about what life would bring her way after this residency was done. Perhaps she'd move to New York, a bigger city where life would throw at her the opportunities not available in Virginia. Maybe she'd even find love in her life, or if things went well between her and Marcus, she could tell him what tugged at her heart. "Tanya!" Layla came rushing into the room, frantically searching for her stethoscope. "We need all hands we can have right now. A large emergency's coming up. More than half a dozen cases. Freak accident, I suppose. Get ready." Tanya groaned and stood up, irritated at herself for feeling bitter at the few minutes of peace that were now broken by the casualties. Moreover, she also felt a heat burning up in her heart for Layla. She was a perfect woman in every way. Mature, focused, beautiful, and kind. She was trying her best to develop a relationship with Andrew Robertson, Marcus's best friend. Tossing out bittersweet thoughts from her head, she got up, fixed a mask on her face, determined not to daydream on call today. She looked at herself in the mirror before stepping out, reminding herself of all the odds that had gotten here today. She would have taken full advantage of the potential life had given her, especially today. "Is everyone ready?" Professor Eric Robertson yelled while coming out of his office. Tanya was surprised to see him, that too in a good way. To them, he was Andrew's dad, but to the outside world, he's more of a legend in the medical sphere, operating only on the brains of the most exclusive patients, the billionaire sort, and he was damn great at it. Today, Professor Eric had decided to scrap off the guise of being the untouchable doctor. Today, Professor Eric had decided to work in the most ordinary of settings, the emergency room. "Incoming," Dr. Ellis Marjorie yelled, fixing a cap on her head and glancing at the old professor with a smile on her face. 26 years in the field and had certainly taken its toll on her. Her eyes were tired and the lines around them showed the weight of the pain of the patient she had carried through all this time. "I just spoke to the paramedics. It's a case of mass poisoning. There are 7 patients in total. Alex Torres, have you prepared the beds?" "Yes, ma'am," Alex replied, determined to prove himself over the fact that he was the newest and youngest amongst them. "Luckily, there are exactly 7 of us to handle the cases." Dr. Ellis replied, her eyes focused on the glass doors, her ears attentive to the sounds of typical sirens that should have been audible by now. But this was not the case. Instead, a lone fleet of 7 ambulances quietly drove to the main gate, not making the slightest fuss at all. Tanya and the rest stared at the fleet in visible confusion for quite a plethora of reasons. The biggest being that they'd never seen these types of large, all-black ambulance vehicles in their life before, certainly not in Virginia before today. "Quickly, get them!" Dr. Ellis rushed forward, not letting the confusion make her judgment fussy, especially not at this critical hour. She grabbed the nearest stretcher being unloaded and slid it quickly into the cubicle in the emergency room, glancing at the patient once to see their current state. Tanya grabbed another patient, bringing them inside and preparing to give them fluids. That was until she glanced at their face with attention. A cold wave of oddness swept over her as she stood there, dumbfounded and shocked. "Andrew?" "Yeah, what's up?" Andrew's voice echoed over the few curtains away. "Really busy." Tanya stepped away from the body, not noticing Andrew's voice that had been cut off from shock. Her eyes were fixated on the body in front of her. The cyanotic blue skin that was sickly and dying, the dull, lifeless eyes that begged to be safe, and most of all, the unsettling nurse that had just appeared in front of her, standing behind the bed and glaring at her deep in the eyes. There's something rather eerie about the woman. She was as if an amateur had drawn a human from memory. All the features were normal, yet as a whole, the face was bizarre. The eyes were set too far apart, the lips were too thin, and the skin too smooth and papery. Tanya felt as if she was looking right through her. In her masked black hand was an old-fashioned stopwatch, clicking away noisily. "Everyone," Dr. Ellis's voice boomed through the floor as he walked past the curtains. "I need full view of all the patients, so kindly draw away the curtains." Tanya swept the curtain away, exposing Andrew's body to the entire room. She watched in horror as one by one the curtains were pushed aside to reveal the bodies behind them. Behind every bed stood an eerie nurse, a catatonic as a robot, only the stopwatches ticking away noisily in the room. In their sheer panic, they had failed to realize that the 7 bodies that appeared were theirs. Every patient was a duplicate of a doctor in the room. Tanya peered around quickly, catching sight of a head of curly hair that was unmistakably hers. Marcus looked down at her with a grief-stricken stillness on his face. At this distance, She could not tell what was wrong with her alternate self. Is this some kind of sick joke? Layla gasped, looking at her doppelganger that lay with Professor Eric. Doesn't make sense. It soon shall, a voice boomed from the end of the room. It was from behind the bed of Tanya's doppelganger. The nurse stepped out, lightly pushing Marcus from the way. It will soon all be clear as a drop of fresh water from a melting glacier. Lady, what the hell? Alex Torres' voice echoed into the quiet hospital. Not hell, not yet, she smiled. You're all in purgatory. All of you are frozen in time here, and the test that lies in front of you will determine the fate of your very being. Dr. Ellis stepped in front of the monotonous woman, observing her from top to bottom with a frown on her face. I'm calling the authorities. This looks to be some sort of terrorist cult, kids. She fished for a phone from her scrub pocket and dialed a 3-digit number on it, holding it against her ear for a good 15 minutes before it shut down. The nurse's eyes glimmered dangerously. I'm afraid that will not be happening. Do you not see, Ellis? You are not in the mortal realm. You're either dead or close to it anyway. What are these? Marcus cried, pointing at the stretchers of dying doppelgangers that lay around the room. His scrunched-up face was red and panicked, horrified at the events that were unfolding. Can't wait for the good part, eh? The nurse smiled, showing her teeth. Tanya's heart skipped a beat. She was not ready for that smile. Her teeth were pitch black, shiny, and clean. Yes, but black, just like midnight. These are your lifelines, dear sinners. Do not feel great about your good health as you stand there. The bodies in the bed are better representation of your lives. If they die, you die. Yet the task is simple. Your alternate body has been inflicted by a deadly poison. The darker your sins, the more gruesome the poison. You must identify it using your skills and cure yourself. There's a catch, however. You must cure yourself before the time runs out. You think you can intimidate us all, yeah? Alex shouted, looking at his body. Well, I want out. We're not going to be a part of this sickly game. The nurse walked back to her place slowly, sitting on a chair next to the IV station. Your call, son. With a determined look on his face, Alex Torres picked up his bag and walked defiantly towards the door. Tanya and the rest watched him get further away, their hearts beating fast. Alex, Layla said, her voice wavering. Something doesn't feel right about this. Come back so we can figure it out together. We will get out of this, I promise. Alex turned around to look at her, a tear streamed down his face. Brada facum, he whispered ever so slightly. You said something? Dr. Ellis asked. I said brada facum. Alex pointed his body laying weakly under Layla's shadow. Weakened vessels, blood leaking from the mouth, nostrils, eyes, ears. It all makes sense now. I can see how much pain I'm in. I don't think I want to gamble stressfully and lose. I'd rather perish painlessly now. Tanya glanced at Alex's withered, corpse-like body, bleeding from all orifices. His half-closed eyes didn't even understand what was going on around him. She watched healthy Alex disappear beyond the front door as Layla rushed behind him, crying and shouting at him to come back. But he never did. He stepped beyond into the unknown, accepting whatever it was that waited for him. His body back in the ER was a different story altogether. The moment Alex Torres disappeared out of the hospital, his alternate self started to bleed faster, the blood becoming darker and pouring out thickly. The ER was quiet as they watched Alex flatline in horror. As soon as the last breath was taken, the stopwatch in the nurse's hand stopped ticking, and she stuffed it away in the folds of her dress. She then pulled the sheets over Alex's head, covering his corpse away forever and wheeling it outside. Tanya was the first to move, and although she was stressed, it wasn't going to pull her down in despair. She was a fighter. She could do this. She rushed towards her alternate self lying half-conscious and terribly restless next to Marcus. Tanya, he began. Go, Marcus. Tend to yourself. We don't have much time. She looked around and spotted Marcus's body lying in the corner, convulsing and spasming violently. It was a disturbing sight indeed. She was grateful that he left immediately. She didn't want to see her eyes that had welled up with tears, watching herself dying like this. She had been unloved all her childhood and strived to be where she was today as an esteemed doctor. She did not deserve the pain. Hey, she whispered, her voice breaking up as she spoke to herself. An alternating self wriggled restlessly, mumbling words deliriously and vomiting slightly. It was a pity to watch. Clearing out her head immediately, Tanya got to work, determined to figure out what had caused her to be like this. She quickly wiped off the vomit and gloved and masked herself, examining the unhealthy body. Her heartbeat was thrice that of a normal person, and she was sweating uncontrollably. Her saliva was drooling out miserably. Tanya worked on her, spiraling into confusion. Those were all the general symptoms. She looked at the patient closely. at the way she thrust her tongue against her closed lips aggressively. It was unusual. Tanya grabbed a pair of tweezers and pried her mouth open with some force, determined to see what it was. Suddenly, something wet and white in color flickered on her tongue. She grabbed it roughly with her tweezers and pulled it out, and holding it up to the light. Tanya's heart sank as she analyzed the object. Small, lacy petals, bright white in color, just like the delicate lace. Hemlock. Professor Eric, I need an oxygen mask, please. Can you pass the trolley, please? It's right next to you. The old man did not reply. Instead, he stared down at the bed in front of him, not moving a muscle. Something bizarre was going on. Intrigued, Tanya walked calmly towards him to see what it was. She stopped mid-sentence. The sight before her eyes was gruesome and graphic indeed. The body that lay in front of them was on the verge of death, and in some ways it was terrifying that it was still alive. It was the worst case out of all. A mass of unrecognizable burnt flesh was all that lay in front of them, melting and mutilated. It was untouchable indeed, as it was quite literally falling apart like boiled meat. Blood and fluid-soaked sheets lay under it as Professor Eric's alternative self gasped for air, too stunned in pain to make any noise. "What is it?" Tanya asked him quietly. "Radiation." Professor Eric removed his glasses and put them in his chest pocket, looking over at his son, Andrew, who stood motionless, crestfallen. "An extremely high dose of radiation, child. I do not know how to salvage this. Whatever I touch falls apart. I lifted his arm, but the flesh was stuck to the pillow and the bone came away clean. He cannot be saved. I cannot be saved." Tanya was horrified. Her heart raced as she observed the wretched being in front of them. Her eyes met those of the nurse behind the bed, who looked back at her solemnly. Not knowing what to do, she quietly grabbed an oxygen mask from the trolley next to him and walked away. "Shh," she cooed at herself, holding her alternate self's hand as she deliriously resisted the oxygen mask covering her face. Yet she calmed down almost immediately as she realized that the mask helped her breathe. As Tanya stabilized herself, she sat down. Her vitals were normal for the time being, and the fluids were pumping into her body. Yet only time would tell if the prognosis would be a good one or not. "Please help," Layla suddenly screamed. Tanya looked up at the grievous Dr. Ellis and Andrew frantically pacing around Layla, who stood there with her hands cupped over her mouth. "Do something quickly, I beg you." Tanya rushed to her bedside to observe the situation. It was grievous indeed, as Tanya sucked her breath in. A burnt Layla lay sprawled on the bed, but lifeless and unconscious, her skin mottled green and blue with yellow blobs of fat exposed to the harsh air. "It's a nitric acid burn," Dr. Ellis muttered, injecting a syringe full of liquid into her veins. The monitor above her beeped alarmingly, showing that all her vitals were off. The nurse standing behind her glared eerily at the stopwatch, which was ticking faster than usual. "We need the crash cart immediately," Andrew muttered. "It's in the minor OT, right outside in the hall," Dr. Ellis pointed. "Andrew, Tanya, you both retrieve it. The professor and Marcus will help me handle her meanwhile." As she ran out of the room with Andrew to get the crash cart, her eyes caught a glimpse of the world beyond the huge glass doors. "Andrew, go get it," she said, unable to take her eyes off the scene. Andrew scuttered away, desperately in search of the cart, while Tanya stood there, hypnotized. The world outside seemed straight out of space, with hundreds and thousands of stars whizzing downward, or maybe they were going upward. It was breathtaking nonetheless, and Tanya was awestruck. Even the border between the dead and the living world was beautiful, she thought. "Tanya, I know you're mesmerized, but we're stuck in a situation here, yeah?" Andrew said painstakingly, dragging the crash cart through the corridor. Tanya broke her train of thought and turned away from the beautiful curtain of purgatory beyond the glass walls, ready to focus on what was necessary. The ER was a mess from within. Layla sat on the floor against the bed in which her alternate self lay, slowly drifting away into the dark void. Marcus looked up at Tanya with the gorgeous doe eyes that pleaded for help as she entered with Andrew. Tanya could see that the situation was dire. The flesh had sizzled, contracted, and burned away, occasionally giving off the fumes of burning tissue, something that made Tanya nauseous. The real Layla wasn't doing too well either. Her forehead was broken into a cold sweat. Her eyes were half closed as Marcus fanned her with a piece of cardboard. She was slipping away too, bit by bit, as Dr. Ellis and the professor aggressively tried to save her. "We have to puncture the lungs. There's too much fluid inside. We need to drain it out." Dr. Ellis removed her glasses, masking herself and preparing to go invasive. "I agree with you. Let me assist you in this." The old professor seemed adamant about helping her out of this, but in his eyes, Tanya could see the life slipping away too. He looked tired as his alternate self lay behind him, nothing but a tattered yet breathing mass of shredded flesh. The darker your sins are, the more gruesome the poison. Tanya wondered what it was that the seemingly innocent man had done that had brought him to such miserable fate. Tanya's train of thought was broken by a painful and deadly scream that had just exited Layla's mouth. She clutched her chest and howled loudly, her eyes threatening to pop out. I know, Dr. Ellis said, her voice wavering as she cut through the Escher on Layla's torso. Spurts of blood flew into the air as she made her way into the chest cavity. We need to hurry, Ellis, the professor said, eyeing the monitor above them that was going crazy. Nothing was right about Layla. Her heart was beating too fast and then too slow, and her blood pressure was fluctuating dangerously. Suddenly, Layla flatlined. The ticking of the stopwatch ceased. She's going into arrhythmia, Dr. Ellis said, retrieving a defibrillator from the crash cart amid the real Layla's anguish howls. She charged it before pressing it against the burnt torso of the poor woman, shocking her up, but it didn't work. The dreadful noise of the flatline dragged through the silence. Dad, do something, Andrew shouted desperately at the old man who looked down at the ground. Below the bed, Layla had fallen into a deep void out of which she was not to be woken. Marcus had stepped away from her, not knowing what to do next. Andrew crouched on the floor next to her body, whimpering grievously over it. It was hard to watch. Tanya felt suffocated. She went outside into the lobby, where the shooting stars were visible from behind the glass. They made her feel safe. She spent a moment thinking about Layla, how she despised her at times out of pure jealousy. Layla was perfect, and Tanya was not. Now that the former had departed, Tanya felt nothing but a hollow vacuum of pain. The world beyond the glass pane looked like a fever dream. Tanya couldn't point out what it was, but she wanted to go outside and let the darkness consume her whole, to let it wrap around its cold embrace. But life was made to be lived. Soon she heard a wheeling sound behind her. Layla's alternate body was being brought out by the strange nurse. The real Layla lay lifelessly in Andrew's arms as he helplessly followed the nurse. His eyes were swollen and red from the tears. Farewell, sweet Layla, Tanya said, patting her head as Andrew walked towards the door. The nurse opened it and turned around, whispering something in Andrew's ear. Andrew looked at her miserably and set the body in his arms next to the alternate one on the bed, acknowledging that he was not to step beyond the door into the next realm. Just like that, the nurse took Layla and stepped out into the unknown, letting the whizzing stars that passed by embrace them in a cloud of silvery dust as their forms faded out of view. Back in the ER, the tense scenario was alleviated a little by the temporary stability of those who lay in bed. Andrew, Tanya, Dr. Ellis, Professor Eric, and Marcus all sat on the floor, eating bland snacks from the vending machine. The hospital was a good otherworldly copy of the one back in the mortal realm, but a strange one too. The canteen that was usually always full of people and doctors was quiet and empty, with nothing but monotonous chairs lying still in the dead darkness. It was clearly a scheme to make them stay within the ER or immediately beyond it. What do you guys think happens when we die? Andrew asked, looking back at the bodies laying on the bed that was battling a severe anthrax infection and was therefore intubated. We get questions, son. We pay for what we do, the professor smiled. Well, Dr. Ellis added, wiping the crumbs of chocolate biscuit off her face, we are kind of dead here, so something must definitely exist. In the end, we all get what's coming to us. Nah, man, Marcus said. It's just darkness. I kind of like that. It's like laying in the dark night under a sky full of stars. Not a single other person there with you. It must be better to have someone. Tanya looked down at her hands, at the chafed peeling skin from all the nitric acid that had oozed out of Layla's wounds. She felt an intense ache in her heart whenever she met Marcus's doe eyes. It was a bittersweet feeling of longing that would never lead anywhere, especially not now when all of them have faced death. Suddenly, out of nowhere, loud musical instruments blared from deep within the depths of the hospital, shaking the walls and all the beds that were lined in the room. Guys, Tanya said, looking around at the nurses, who looked down with solemn expressions on their face. What's happening? Another development, this morbid joke, that's what's happening. The professor's face seemed strained as the sweat broke out on his forehead. He was clearly in pain. It's Beethoven, Symphony No. 9. Where's it blaring from? Andrew asked. This isn't good, Dr. Ellis wiped the professor's head with a handkerchief. How are you feeling? Not good, the professor replied, clutching his chest. Andrew held him as he flopped on the ground like a rag doll. On the bed, his alternate self gasped and sputtered blood. Tanya got up quickly to see what the instability was up there. The sight was horrific indeed. She'd seen brutal car accidents where victims were practically shredded up, and this was no different. She observed him closely, looking at the strands of muscle and fat on his body that were literally falling apart. The sheets were soaked underneath, and he was stuck to them. No way would be possible to remove them without large chunks of his flesh coming off, too. When Tanya saw what the problem was, her heart sank. His windpipe was completely exposed in his neck, and the little holes had started to develop in it. He's finding it hard to breathe. Yet, the eyes were alive, old eyes, burnt and tired, yet very much awake and aware, feeling every bit of the agonizing pain, begging her to let him go. That was not the only problem, though. On Marcus's bed, a different complication seemed to be developing, right at the same forsaken time. There's a loud screeching sound as the real Marcus on the floor choked violently, his face turning purple, as Symphony No. 9 blared in the background, the climax speeding up as the events unfolded in the ER. His alternate self sat spasming in the bed, contorting forcefully in all sorts of positions, his poisoned muscles killing him from within. "We need to intubate, Dad. Tanya, perform the Heimlich on our Marcus. Quick," Andrew said, dragging the crash cart towards his father's bed. Panicking, Tanya rushed behind a now unconscious Marcus who lay pitifully on the floor. As she lifted him, his muscles were abnormally stiff, not letting her perform the maneuver. She huffed and puffed in anxiety, desperately trying to push his lungs upward, but his stiffened abdominal muscles prevented her from making any progress. As Beethoven played away, things on the professor's bed weren't looking good either. Hands shaking, Andrew had tried to insert a tube down his father's throat, but it was too fragile and powdery to do any good. Instead, his shivering hands caused 2 more perforations. "Give it to me," Dr. Ellis snatched a tube from Andrew's hand in desperation, focusing and trying to insert it properly. There's a wet, slicky sound as painful and guttural groan came out of the patient's throat. Dr. Ellis had punctured his fragile lung. "What have you done?" Andrew screamed, stepping back and looking at the scene in horror. "What did you do? What the heck did you do?" "Andrew," the real professor yelled from the ground. "Shut up and come here." In tears, Andrew knelt down next to his father, who pulled him into a sitting position. The professor had turned towards Tanya. "How's the Heimlich going, girl?" "Not so good," Tanya yelled at her, flushed face dripping from the sheer effort. The professor said, turning feebly to face the eerie nurse that stood at the end of the bed, watching the stopwatch as it ticked dangerously away. "I'd like to make a bargain." That was Waltz of the Agonizing Ones by Scare in a Box from the Creepypasta subreddit. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next time.